Okay, hello and welcome to the first event of Trinity Term for the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism. This is Politics in a Petrostate, the Duality of Leadership in Venezuela. Today, we will aim to cover an overview of the past, present and future of Venezuela, as well as a country deeply affected by an abundance of natural resources, political mismanagement and failing institutions. The discussion will be broken down into two main parts. Firstly, we will talk about the reasons for Venezuela's political crisis, which has seen two men claiming to be the rightful president of the country, and the social crisis encapsulated by the estimated 4.1 to 6 million Venezuelans, or about 20% of Venezuela's total population, who have emigrated from the country. Then we will hear the panelists' thoughts on sorry, we just have Dr. Naím, who is trying to join. I'm just making him a panelist. I hope that's okay. Fantastic. Okay. Dr. Naím. Dr. Naím, are you able to hear me? Fantastic. Sorry about that. So then we will hear the panelists' thoughts on the future of the country, including its links to the US, as well as Iran, Russia, and the potential proxy conflict. We'll be in discussion for around 40 minutes, leaving about 20 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. In this final segment, I will be able to unmute you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you, Dr. Naím.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So we will be in like 15 minutes outside.
Oh, were you not on as a panelist?
Sorry?
Were you not on
but I was just waiting, but here we are. Sorry.
My apologies about that. So we'll be in discussion for around 40 minutes today, leaving about 20 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. In this final segment, I'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question directly to our panelists by pressing the raise hand feature. It is now my pleasure to introduce our brilliant panel of experts. We have Dr. Moisés Naím, who served as Venezuela's Minister of Trade and Industry, the Director of Venezuela's Central Bank, and the Executive Director of the World Bank in the early 1990s, as well as being an internationally renowned best-selling author, economist, columnist, and former editor of Foreign Policy, and a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Fabiana Perera is an assistant professor at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, previously a Rosenthal Fellow at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and has worked as a research associate at Mitsubishi International Corporation, focusing on Latin America and the energy and infrastructure sectors. And finally, we have Joseph Humire, a global security expert and author who specializes in analyzing trans-regional threats in the Western Hemisphere, and the current executive director of the national security think tank, Center for a Secure Free Society. Thank you all so much for coming on today. So now I'd like to begin by offering each panelist a few minutes to explain their work in more detail and how it relates to Venezuela. Dr. Naím, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for the invitation. I just want to make 2 points. One about the origins of the crisis and Chavez's ascent. And then I want to make some comments about the reasons, the main reasons for the devastation that the country is suffering. Quickly, the narrative that Chavez and others supported, and that you can still find it today in many media reports and so on, is that the ascent of the Chavez regime and Hugo Chavez had to do a lot with Venezuela's poverty at the time, the inequality, and corruption. And so those three factors together led people to just fed up, vote for an alternative candidate that offered and promised solutions to this problem. That, however, is not enough to explain the Chavez's victory at the polls in 1999, 98, 99, and then his very long, protracted tenure that, Maduro continues that that same regime. So we have more than 20 years. The fact of the matter is that if poverty was an issue, according to the United Nations Human Development Report, Venezuela was not the worst country. It was, there were many other countries that faced far worse situations in terms of poverty. And you didn't see the kind of dynamics that we saw in Venezuela. The same with inequality. Of course, there was inequality. There is inequality now. In fact, there is more inequality than in the past. But the fact of the matter is that in terms of inequality at that time, in the late 90s, Colombia, Chile, Brazil had much worse inequality indicators, like the Gini coefficient that measures inequality was much, much worse in those countries. So that alone cannot explain Chavez's ascent. And then in terms of corruption, if you take the Transparency International yearly survey, an index of corruption perception in the world, Venezuela was not at the top at all. Venezuela did, of course. This is not to say that in Venezuela we didn't have a lot of poverty, clearly unjustified given the country's and the nation's wealth, or that there wasn't there a lot of inequality, or that corruption was not an issue. All three things were important issues, but many other countries in Latin America had much worse indicators in these areas than Venezuela. So something else happened there that we have not yet had the explanation, the full explanation. So that's my point about the origins of the regime that has created such devastation in the country. And then the second set of questions is why? Why is the country in such dire situation and such tragedy, in fact? Well, the most common commentary has to do with the socialismo del siglo XXI, the 21st century socialism, which is what Chavez coined and tried to export to the world. And of course, his policies were, he had a socialist agenda. He instrumented, many of his policies follow that recipe and that set of policy prescriptions. But other countries had it also, and much worse, in fact. And we don't see in those other countries the devastation that we see in Venezuela. To be precise, today the average Venezuelan is poorer than the average Haitian. So if you're poor in Haiti, you're better off than being poor in Venezuela. The GDP of the country has shrunk by 75% in the last decade. So it is a total catastrophe. We have not seen, economic historians have not seen the different, the kind of devastation that we see in Venezuela. So it is, socialism doesn't seem to be enough to explain it. Populism doesn't seem to be enough to explain it, and I can elaborate on that. And so what essentially, my main message is that there is often an unexplained explanation, an unexplained set of factors that also need to be brought to the conversation about what drove the situation in Venezuela and what drives the situation now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Naím. Dr. Perera, would you like to continue?
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to join this interesting conversation and to sit here with Moisés and Joseph, both of whom I admire greatly. I am an assistant professor at the William J. Perry Center, and I teach at Georgetown University and George Washington University, both in Washington, D.C., mostly in the area of security and defense in the Western Hemisphere with a focus on Venezuela. And what brought me to have this focus in Venezuela is partly that I grew up in Venezuela. My parents are Venezuelan, so I got to experience the culture firsthand, kind of similar to the aside conversation we were having before this started. But I think what ultimately brought me to focus on it is exactly what Moisés just described. We don't know what happened in Venezuela. I grew up in a country that was the shining hope for Latin America. that was described as the darling of the development set. It was a country where people went to look for answers. How is it that Venezuela can be so democratic when it's sitting on oil? How is it that Venezuela is so prosperous in the midst of poverty? How is it that Venezuela is able to have the concord fly between Caracas and Paris when there's inequality and suffering? What is Venezuela doing right? And I think in this quest to look for things that Venezuela was doing right, academia, political scientists, economists like Dr. Naím, everybody missed things that were potentially going wrong in the country. Things that we're still trying to dig out that would explain why a country that was once so rich and prosperous would be a victim of the unfortunate situation we are witnessing today. I think the armed forces played a very important role in the change from the prosperous Venezuela I described a second ago to what we're seeing today. In particular, I think the regime, so starting with Hugo Chavez and continuing on to Nicolás Maduro, played a role in turning the military away from its role as a protector of the state, a guarantor of the borders and the security of the people living inside the border and the integrity of the territory, into an institution that protects the regime. That is, that acts whenever Chavez or Maduro feel threatened by the people that live inside the country. And we saw that deterioration happen over time, and I'm happy to talk more about it. The second thing I hope we get to talk about is what might happen going forward. I think I have an incurable bias toward optimism, and I, to this day, enjoy thinking about the day that Venezuela will return to democracy. I think a big part of that, a big question that's going to be present if there is a democratic transition in Venezuela, is what might the security and defense sector look like? What could be a possible arrangement for the military that prevents Venezuela from going down this path again, shows learning from the region, and also serves as an example to other countries that might be going in the same direction? Thinking about Nicaragua, of course. And with that, I'll stop so I don't go into Joseph's.
Fantastic. Mr. Humire, would you like to continue?
Yes. Well, first of all, Lucia, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with the Oxford Forum for questioning extremism. It's a pleasure also to be with Moisés and Fabiana, also two scholars that I very much respect their work. And I like the way we're starting the conversation because it's kind of starting under this umbrella of what is Venezuela. It's sort of this complexity, this mystery that several governments haven't been able to solve. And I don't just mean the US government, I mean governments around the world have been studying this complexity, particularly since 2017. And I myself at the center, I direct a national security think tank here in Washington called the Center for Secure Free Society. And we've been looking at Venezuela for about a decade. And during this time, we've learned a lot of things, but every time we learn a little bit more, we just find out how much more complex it is. And it was in 2019 that I started to kind of wrestle a little bit with some new concepts, new ideas. And I had to travel through many parts of Latin America, particularly Colombia and Brazil, speaking with the ministries of defense and talking about the complexity of the Venezuela crisis. And what I want to do just for real briefly, I want to show you this story, because oftentimes when you speak with a minister, you have 10 minutes, 15 minutes to be able to give a briefing. You don't have all the time in the world. And so what I would do, because we specialize in looking at one aspect of the crisis in Venezuela, I would tell a story to kind of symbolize what the significance of how complex Venezuela really is. So I'm going to tell the story right now, and what I'd like you to do, just kind of imagine who I'm talking about as I tell the story. Moisés and Fabiana are going to get it right off the bat. It's the story of a lieutenant colonel, right? A lieutenant colonel who wanted to capture his country by force, but failed through a failed coup, but then got elected as president and then sparked a revolution. He immediately nationalized natural resources and used those resources, particularly petroleum, to spark a revolution first in his country, then throughout the region, all the while accusing his adversaries as imperialists looking to take out his regime. This lieutenant colonel turned president, died after 14 years as president, but not before leaving a legacy of crime, corruption, and conflict. So I tell that story and everyone's like, Joseph, I got you. I know you're talking about Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chavez. I say, but I'm not. I'm talking about Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. So why is the story of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the former president of Egypt, identical to the story of Hugo Chavez? Because there are mysteries that connect Venezuela to the Middle East that we have yet to explore. And that's something that at my center we specialize in, is what we dedicated ourselves to. And I hope to share some of that with you today. So I'll end with that, just to kind of leave that intrigue. But there is a lot of connections to the Middle East that explain a lot of what's happening inside Venezuela.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for those introductions. So we've spoken a little bit about what the current political situation is. Moisés, you mentioned it in some detail. So given the state of the crisis that the country now finds itself in, I think it's important that we actually try to understand some of the reasons, or at least the main reasons, of how we actually reached this point. So a starting point would be the abundance of crude oil in the country. So as of January 2020, Venezuela had the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and it's widely accepted as a petrostate, so a nation whose economy is heavily reliant on the extraction and exportation of oil. And it's also usually associated with highly concentrated economic and political power, as well as institutions that are extremely susceptible to corruption. So Dr. Naím, you've worked as the Minister of Trade and Industry in Venezuela, and you've also written extensively about the oil industry in Venezuela. So how did the discovery and development of the oil industry contribute to the long-term decline of the country?
It was very important, and Venezuela is a petrostate, meaning that the only game in town economically was oil for a long time. Oil concentrates political power and concentrates economic power in many ways. If you control the oil industry, you control a lot of the politics of the nation and, of course, the economy. But what I want is to stress the factor, this mystery about what happened in Venezuela and why is it still, why has it become so sustainable, this debacle? Why is the debacle sustainable? And what happened? Is there a variable that we are not seeing that drove the situation? And I think there is, and that is Cuba. Because in the excellent description that Joseph made of the lieutenant colonels, we need to add, in the case of Hugo Chavez, his infatuation and annexation and enamoramiento that he had with Fidel, and that Fidel returned, Fidel Castro. And he returned the almost father and son relationship, had a very strong emotional attachment, but that was converted into policy. And so in the mystery variable, one of the mystery variables is that Venezuela is not only a failed state, but is an occupied state in which the government of Cuba sent a lot of operatives, and it had a huge influence in the armed forces, huge influence in the intelligence and security services, huge influence in appointments in the economic realm. And essentially, the Cubans looted my country for more than 20 years. There is plenty of evidence. And so you cannot talk about Venezuela, what happened in Venezuela and what can happen in Venezuela without you including what the Cuba factor. And the reason why is that is not that visible is that it was by definition a clandestine operation. So this was a stealthy, furtive occupation of a nation by another without a shot. There was not a, they did not occupy the country. Chavez gave the country to the Cubans. And the Cubans proceeded to control the most critical institutions of the nation and to loot the country. A lot of the economic stability that Cuba has enjoyed precariously, but what was better than the alternative, what came from the looting of Venezuela. And not just oil, mind you. They looted the country in a variety of ways. Now that Venezuela is bankrupt and devastated, the Cubans are paying the consequences. The Cuban economy is the worst it has been since it lost the support of the Soviet Union. And that is essentially because Venezuela is no longer lootable. Everything that had to be looted was looted. And that is a very important factor. And they continue to be there. They're providing assistance and advice in terms of repression, torture, politics, and the running of the country.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So moving on, many people attribute the present situation in Venezuela to the administrations of Hugo Chavez and subsequently of his successor, Nicolas Maduro. Chavez won the presidential election in 1998 after having campaigned for a more socialist regime, which is obviously explained by the link with Cuba. Dr. Pereira, what made Chavez so personable to so many Venezuelans? What did he represent for Venezuela at the time?
I think though the inequality was not as bad in Venezuela as it was in other countries in Latin America, as Dr. Naím explained, we cannot discount the role that inequality played in Chavez's rise to power because he used it to fuel his rhetoric. Chavez was a very charismatic guy. Every account from people that met him face to face said it was impossible not to like him. And he used the inequality that existed in Venezuela, which, while not as bad as what we were seeing in neighboring countries, I think was harder to stomach in Venezuela because spending in Venezuela, the type of spending that would have been needed to alleviate this inequality, needn't be redistributive spending. That is, because Venezuela is a petrostate, as we're talking about, all Venezuela had to do in the eyes of people living in Venezuela is correctly distribute that money so that it benefited all segments of society. It was not necessary for the lower socioeconomic classes in Venezuela to succeed, for the higher classes to be taxed, as we're seeing in the United States and as is common in countries that rely on taxation. Social spending in Venezuela need not be redistributive. It was essentially distributive of this money that Venezuelans felt entitled to because they were literally sitting on top of it. Chavez, this makes for really convincing populist speeches, and Chavez mastered that genre. He was online through his, not online, he was on TV through his weekly TV address longer. If you combine all those hours, he was on television longer than the longest running television program in the United States, Meet the Press. He talked nonstop. And he talked nonstop about inequality, about poverty, and about how he himself was a representative of the people that had been on the losing side of the inequality. Hugo Chavez not only didn't come from the capital of Venezuela, Caracas, he came from the interior of the country. He had a name that was like a salt of the earth Venezuelan name, not an immigrant name like many other people have that suggested like exotic origins, like in Spain or Italy. His name was salt of the earth Venezuelan. His skin color was closer to my skin color, which is what people think of when they think of Venezuelans. But again, because of the inequality, was not something you saw at the top levels. If you were to look up pictures of Venezuelan presidents prior to Hugo Chavez, they most certainly did not look like me. So he was able to use all of this to really fuel him, and people connected. I don't think Nicolas Maduro has been as successful because even though he shares this working man backdrop that Chavez has, he doesn't have the natural talent for turning that into an appeal to the masses.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So another question for Dr. Naím. So although Chavez was elected democratically, his political origins are rooted in his orchestration of two failed coup attempts against the Perez administration in 1992, during which you stated in your book, Paper Tigers and Minotaurs, that Venezuelans saw the first possibility of a military dictatorship. So at what point do you think during his presidency, he started edging towards authoritarianism?
Well, first I wanted to clarify something you said in your preamble to Fabiana's question, saying that he won the election in 99, 98 and took power in 99 with a lot of support. He was very popular. That is not true. Those elections had huge levels of abstentionism. People, so the number of actual Venezuelans that voted for Chavez and allowed him to become president of a democracy were a minority. So that's another misconception about the popularity and the poll during that took Chavez to power. And once he got to power, he had the mantra. The mantra is one man, one woman, one vote, one time. And then he started using the instruments of democracy to undermine democracy. So he had an onslaught, a very efficient and tough onslaught on checks and balances. He packed the Supreme Court with his loyalists. He controlled Congress. He bought or expelled or neutralized members of Congress that were not with him. It was either with him or against him. And if you were against him, it was dire straits. And so there was, in 2002, there was an attempted coup against him that failed. But he was detained for a number of hours, taken to a naval base in an island in La Chila in the Venezuelan Caribbean. And then he came back. And I think what we know is that when he went back, he said, this is not going to happen to me again, ever. And so I am going to do everything necessary to avoid another repetition of a coup. In fact, it was it had a lot of military involved. So that was a turning point, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. So Joseph, during the early 2000s, during the beginning of Chavez's administration, we saw him beginning to expand his international rapport, notably with Russia. Do you think that this is an indicator in which his leadership started going?
Yes, I think Chavez understood that international alliances were important for him to be able to maintain his power in Venezuela, and he increased those alliances over his time. But I want to touch on a few things that we discussed, and I like the focus on, Lucy, on the long-term origins, because I really think we have to go way back in history to fully understand how this crisis developed, even before Chavez. And so Moisés talked about the Cuba factor, the Cuba aspect of this, and I think the international community was very late to understand Cuba's involvement in the Venezuela crisis. Many Venezuelans had reported about it, but it hadn't got the echo that it needed in the international community yet. And at this point in 2021, it's indisputable the level of Cuban presence, particularly within military intelligence services, but all throughout the country, that's been able to steer Venezuela towards this conflict. But I'm gonna present the Syria aspect, mentioning another petrostate, right? And I kind of alluded to it in my introduction. So there's two aspects of Venezuela I think that need to be understood from a historical perspective. The first is mass migration. So there's been waves of mass migration from the Middle East that go all the way back to the 19th century. It begins in 1880 with the Ottoman Empire, when it begins to encroach on mostly Maronite Christians. And a lot of those Maronite Christians from the Middle East migrated or actually sought refuge in South America, particularly in three countries: Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela. The next wave is in 1910, which is the Armenian genocide, where Armenians were being persecuted also by the Turks, also by the Ottomans, and they also found refuge, a lot of them, in Venezuela. It's actually why they call most Venezuelans of Arab descent Turcos, because they were given Turkish papers, even though they weren't from literally Turkey. They were from what's now Turkey. They were from a lot from Syria, from Lebanon. Fast forward about 50 years and you go into the 1960s, and it's the next wave of mass migration. And this is during the rise of dictatorships in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. But what happens, and this often happens, unfortunately, with a lot of refugee outflows, is there's a level of a rat line that's established, essentially a clandestine route. And so there's one aspect of this that's very important to understand in Venezuela prior to the dawn of the Bolivarian Revolution. In the 1960s, the Cubans had already looked at Venezuela as their next conquest, because they knew that if they could capture Venezuela, they capture the oil. So they sent a lot of money, they sent a lot of fighters, they sent a lot of training to the communists in Venezuela to be able to spark another revolution in that country. But they failed. By 1964, the leadership of the Communist Party of Venezuela was captured and imprisoned in a San Carlos prison in Venezuela. Who broke them out? A gentleman named Nehime Chequin Simon, or otherwise known as Simon el Árabe, in Venezuela, a Syrian refugee that we, to this day, is part of that mysteries of Venezuela. We don't fully understand who he is, but he not only dug the tunnel to break them out of prison, but he changed the doctrine. And this is important to understand the distinction from Cuba, because Cuba is important, but it's not the only factor. Because Cuban was installing a method, a doctrine of guerrilla warfare, which is what worked in Cuba, but didn't work in Angola, didn't work in Bolivia, and didn't work in other countries with bigger militaries. And so what the Syrians showed was you don't have to use guerrilla warfare. Don't try to attack your military from the jungles, infiltrate them. That's a different doctrinal strategy. It's insurgency. And that's the dawn of the concept of the Bolivarian Revolutionary Movement, which is what Chavez took, to not attack the military, but infiltrate the military, to be able to capture and recruit young officers and young soldiers to be able to spark a revolution that would come in. Before there was this concept of Greater Colombia, there was the concept of Greater Syria. Greater Syria is what the Ottomans used to use social cultural identity as a way to unify a region, to be able to transcend borders and boundaries and capture territory without the military. That's asymmetric war in its finest sense. Chavez learned this from the pan-Arab nationalist movement. He emulated this when he came to power. The Cubans augmented this with their intelligence capabilities, their operational structure, and their high level of understanding of networks. But in the end of the day, the strategy that the Venezuelan most represents in the history of the world is the strategy that was used by the pan-Arab nationalists to conquer the Middle East. That's why I mentioned the Nasser comparison in the beginning. And that's where you start to begin to understand why Chavez, at the beginning of his presidency, took trips to Iraq immediately after becoming president, or took trips later to Iran, because he knew he had to understand the Middle East if he was going to remain in power inside Venezuela. So that was I think, a central point of his tenure, his mandate, and Nicolas Maduro has carried that forward. And now we're seeing it very visibly in Venezuela with the presence of Iranian tankers and Hezbollah support cells and all the stuff that we know in modern day construct of Venezuela. But that network was constructed many, many years ago.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That was incredibly insightful, and more to that to come in a minute. So moving on now to what is happening now. So we've talked a bit about the long-term reasons for the decline of the state. How does this all play into the current situation? So we see a repetition of the mismanagement of Venezuela's national oil company, PDVSA, under Chavez, and subsequently under his successor Maduro. So Dr. Naím, in one of your books, Paper Tigers and Minotaurs, you argued that this mismanagement occurred long before then as well, before Perez's reforms in the early 1990s. So what can this repetition of the mismanagement of the company be attributed to?
When I wrote that in 1993, we had not seen what happened in Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA. It is not comparable. PDVSA before that had some problems with corruption, but it was not a major issue. It was considered by the international oil industry as one of the best managed oil companies in the world. And it had a lot of its staff, senior staff and middle level managers were coveted by the large oil companies elsewhere. Chavez fired all of them. Notably, in a television show, he started calling them by names, and he fired all of them. And almost all of them immediately found jobs at very high levels in the international oil industry. So it is not true that it's just the same, and the corruption in PDVSA is just a continuation of what it was. It is orders of magnitude different, and the quality, quantity, and nature of the corruption that we are seeing now, and we have seen, is different to the point in which Petróleos de Venezuela, for all intent and purposes, does not exist anymore. It exists as a logo, as a building, as a vehicle to channel money laundering schemes. But if the proof is that the Maduro government is looking desperately for foreign oil companies to come and operate the fields that have been abandoned or destructed. So we have seen, therefore, the destruction of one of the world's top oil companies in the world, which is just par for the course of a government, of a regime that destroyed the productive capacity of the country. This did not only happen with oil. You look at any way, you look at aluminum, at steel, at the petrochemicals, the small and medium enterprises. There's a devastation. As I said before, economic historians will tell you that they have not seen that level of destruction, even in countries that had horrible wars. And so the question is, what I asked before, how do they make the debacle sustainable?
Amazing. And do you have any ideas on how we could make this sustainable?
It's a combination. You see, Venezuela is a failed nation. It is also an occupied nation by Cuba. and now others. And I'm sure that Joseph can tell us more about other countries of the Middle East that are now have a larger presence in Venezuela. So it is a occupied country by foreign powers. It is a failed state. It is a state that is not capable of providing food or medicine or health or education or jobs to its population. But what is not sufficiently understood is that it's also a criminalized state. It's a mafia state, meaning that the people at the top of the dictatorship, of the Maduro dictatorship, are also the regents and the heads of an organized crime, of a vast network of organized crime that has Venezuela at the center. So you need, in order you need to dismantle that if you ever want Venezuela to have a normal attempt at recovery, and not to become chronically paralyzed, destructed. You will need to take out these organized criminals, an organized criminal syndicate that is operating at the top of the Venezuelan dictatorship, and it's not going to be easy.
Lucy, if I can make a comment.
Of course.
Here, thank you. First, I wanted to say, because I never get the opportunity to do this, that I am the daughter of one of the people that Moisés was talking about. My father worked for the Venezuelan oil company when it was very professional, and ended up losing his job to Chavez, exactly as Moisés described, and ended up working in Qatar. So that the links to the Arab countries, as Joseph described, are very strong there. Those are kind of a personal aside, just because I never got a chance to say that. As an overarching comment, I wanted to say that both Joseph and Moisés are describing something that we also saw in the security sector, which is ultimately what's making the regime successful and entrenched, in my opinion, which is that despite referring to themselves as the revolution, as the revolution, in reality, they sought to change all these institutions through erosion. So that the change in Venezuela did not happen overnight. It happened rather slowly. So when you go look for the first mentions of Venezuela, perhaps not being a shining beacon of democracy, they don't come until 2007, 2008 from Freedom House ratings of countries around the world. That's almost a decade after Chavez had been in power, and after a series of very slow changes. And I think it was these slow changes that made it hard for the international community initially to react the way we have with the situations with the uprisings that have happened in the Arab world, because they were covered up. It appeared, as you referenced in your remarks, that he had won by a landslide. So if he won by a landslide, perhaps the constitutional reforms are what the people actually want. And if the constitutional reforms call for an expanded Supreme Court, then perhaps that's okay, and perhaps that's okay, and perhaps that's okay. And so we went on a very, very slow erosion of democracy. And I think it was that very slow process that allowed them to deeply entrench the regime, and that has made it a lot harder to be critical of the regime at the moments when it would have made a difference. Now, while I support, of course, calls for the return to democracy in Venezuela, I think a call today has like 10% of the effectiveness that it would have had in 2003 and 2004 when we started seeing the first deaths of protesters in Caracas.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So
can I also I don't want to be like the third wheel on this, but I want to add a little bit, because I think it's really interesting question. I think it is really kind of the central question of why, right? Why are they still persisting in power? And I think Moisés laid that out very beautifully, because this is really what the policy community is wrestling with. And what I like to add my 2 cents on that is that the reason I believe that the regime, and I mean the Chavez and now Maduro regime, persists in power is because they have a strategy. They know what they're doing. There's been a misconception that they were lost or weak or fractured. And we've seen through time that while there is infighting, but they understand that there's an end post, a goalpost of where they want to go. There's 2 particular concepts that at the center that we've been wrestling with and we've been studying to be able to apply to Venezuela to see if that fits. And one of them, Fabiana would know very well, because it was originated at her center, at the William J. Perry Center at National Defense University, and it's the concept of convergence. I think convergence is a very interesting and very powerful concept because it explains the unification of 2 phenomena that have dominated so far the 21st century: international terrorism and transnational organized crime, ordinarily you would think that these two phenomena actually wouldn't unite because they have very different goals, right? One's a profit motive, the other one has a political cause. But what we've seen over time is while there isn't a unification on a strategic level, like terrorists and criminals aren't combining their strategies, what you see is a combination at the logistical level. Logistical services, whether you're an accountant, a technician, a transportation, whatever, if you're an illicit actor and you're providing services for a criminal organization, a drug cartel, you're likely to be a good candidate to be a criminal actor to provide logistical services for a terrorist organization. Venezuela has opened up its country to this convergence and has become a hub, a global hub for that convergence to invite all kinds of illicit actors into its country to be able to further erode those institutions, as Fabiana was mentioning. So the strategy and the use of networks, I think, is something very sophisticated at what the regime is doing. And those networks don't function like a traditional democratic state. Like when we look at Venezuela with our lens, we'll see a president, a vice president, a minister, a political party, but that's really a facade because underneath that, there's what Moisés was talking about, this criminal element that really is the power structure behind it. So another term, the other concept that I want to introduce is, we've been wrestling with these terms to kind of understand what is the Venezuelan regime. And one that we're studying is a concept I'd like to introduce is called the parallel state. And what's a parallel state? So a parallel state is a term that was coined by an American historian named Robert Paxton. Robert Paxton, go back 100 years when he was studying World War I, he wanted to understand what happens when a sub-state structure, essentially a criminal structure, grows so powerful that it overtakes the power of a state. It actually provides more services than that of a state. But when you combine that sub-state structure with a totalitarian ideology that has a strategic conquest in mind, then you find out what can explain the Empire of Japan, the Ottoman Empire, and even Nazi Germany in its time. And I don't think we've seen that level of a combination in the modern times in the Western Hemisphere until we saw the Bolivarian Revolution and the criminalized state of Venezuela. So these are concepts that I think are very new for us here in the Western Hemisphere. We've studied them in other parts of the world. And I mentioned the Middle East a lot. We've studied this when we look at the Iranian Revolution, when you look at the Pan-Arab nationalist movement of the 20th century. But in the Western Hemisphere, we haven't seen that at this level before. That's why I think there really is no precedent for Venezuela in Latin America. But there is precedence for Venezuela in other parts of the world. And that's kind of where we have to go to start to understand how this is evolving or devolving.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So why don't we actually turn to you, Joseph? You wrote a brief on the Maduro-Hezbollah nexus, which was especially insightful, as you mentioned, with the crime-terror convergence and Iran's support of Maduro via Hezbollah cells in Venezuela. Could you explain in a little bit more detail what these Hezbollah cells are trying to do in Venezuela and the link between Maduro and Hezbollah?
Sure. So yeah, the report you're referring to, Lucy, is a report I wrote for the Atlantic Council. I believe it was in October of last year, called the Maduro-Hezbollah nexus. And the point of the report was actually what Moisés was talking about, because when it came to Cuba, I think the international community, the scholarly community, was a little bit late to really show that connection, but in a meaningful way, not just in a media way or not just in a political way where you would say statements. And we've heard statements for a long time, Cubans in Venezuela, but we need to see the evidence. We need to see the analysis. And that came a little bit late before it was pretty obvious that Cuba was entrenched in Venezuela. So the purpose of the Hezbollah paper was to not make the same mistake with Hezbollah, because up until then, we had heard a lot about Hezbollah being in Venezuela. We had a lot of comments from different political figures and others in the media, but no one really had seen or understood what did they mean by this Hezbollah presence in Venezuela. There was everything from alarmist claims that were, you have Hezbollah fighting in the jungles in Venezuela, which were exaggerations of the reality. And then you had minimalist claims that say, no, it's an exaggeration, it doesn't exist, which is also not true. So the point of the paper was to get into the nuance. And what the paper focuses on something called Hezbollah support cells. So if you take into context the migration aspect that I mentioned in my previous comments, there exists a Lebanese diaspora all throughout Latin America. Now, I want to emphasize what I'm going to say. The Lebanese diaspora in Latin America is a healthy diaspora for many of the economies in the region because they provided some of the best businesses, export, import services, and have actually helped grow these economies. So on net, it's been very productive. But Venezuela is one of those cases where that diaspora has been captured by the regime like it has captured many other aspects of the population. So in that, the Hezbollah from Lebanon understood that it needs to tap into these diasporas in order to be able to project its power. when 15% of Lebanon's GDP has come from remittances, Hezbollah understands it needs to go abroad to be able to maintain their power structure at home. And so Venezuela was one of those communities, the Lebanese community in Venezuela was one of those that they tapped into, and they built what we call support cells. So this is an important distinction for the intelligence community, because there's a difference between a card-carrying, Nasrallah-approved Hezbollah member, like somebody that's actually from the Hezbollah hierarchy in Lebanon, to someone that's not perhaps part of that hierarchy vertically, but is someone that's sympathetic to Hezbollah and would even provide services and support to Hezbollah. So in Venezuela, we see more of those support networks, but the important part is that those support networks exist to be able to create conditions so that those Hezbollah operators can come in. And what we've seen over time is we've seen some of those operatives arriving in Venezuela, and that support network is there. Some of these Hezbollah support networks exist inside the Venezuelan government. I'll give you one example. A gentleman named Ghazi Nasreddin was a Venezuelan diplomat in Syria. He held a post equivalent to a charge d'affaires. I'm sorry, equivalent to the DCM. He was the number 2 in the embassy. And he was one of the individuals that was responsible for this scheme that was allowing documentation to flow from the Venezuelan Immigration Agency to suspected members of different international terrorist organizations, including Hezbollah. And according to a 2020 indictment of another Syrian Venezuelan, this indictment by the Department of Justice accuses Ghazi Nasreddin of facilitating a weapons for cocaine scheme between Hezbollah, the FARC, and the Venezuelan regime. So it's just one example, it's one nugget. In the report, I go into some of these other individuals, but the point was really to put context and nuance into a claim that for a long time had been essentially confused and not properly documented. So that's a little bit on the Hezbollah-Maduro connection.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So I think we have the time for one final question before we open the floor to our audience. So to all of you, but let's start with Dr. Naím. In your opinion, where is Venezuela headed in the future? And what can the international community do now to help the state?
There are two essential scenarios. One is more of the same, and another is rebuilding, the rebuilding of the country. And both are very, very hard to estimate in terms of probabilities. And both can have different nuances. More of the same has to do with a deepening of the qualifications I have made of the country. In this, throughout this conversation, I have introduced different qualifiers and descriptors of Venezuela. So it's a failed state, unable to provide basic public goods to the population. It's an occupied state where foreign powers call the shots and essentially for their own national interest and not for the interest of Venezuela. So it is occupied, is it failed, is it occupied, and is criminalized. And criminalized does not only mean that you have high levels of crime in the streets. It means that transnational illicit networks that traffic in everything from people to drugs to weapons to money laundering operate quite comfortably in Venezuela. And some of them are connected to other regimes, by the way, making the situation more complicated. So, you know, you can have more of the same, and that means that because the other qualifier that I had not introduced and I introduce now is that it is a fragmented country. Now it is very hard to go from one city in Venezuela to another city. The country is fragmented, it's not connected. It has pockets and isolation and different warlords or friends of the government or independent criminals or narco traffickers control different areas. So we have two governments in Caracas. One is a dictatorship, the Maduro dictatorship, and we know who they are and what they control. And then we have the Guaido regime, which is, you know, despite its precariousness, its difficulties, because they're fighting a monster, as you know, and they also, they are recognized by over 50 nations. So all of the large democracies in the world recognize the Guaido regime. But other than that fragmentation at the top and in the capital, you have fragmentations throughout the region. You have what it's called the Arco Minero in the south, which is essentially a very rich regions in terms of minerals and gold and coltan and all of that. Well, the Maduro government sought the help of the Colombian guerrillas, of the FARC and the ELN, who now control very large swaths of the south of Venezuela that have all of these mineral riches. And again, eradicating them is not going to be easy. So that is more of the same scenario, and I can elaborate on details. But it's tragic and it's terrible, and I hope we can avoid it. And to avoid it, you essentially have to fight the notion that this is a problem for that Venezuelans have to decide this. And the point is that the Venezuelan opposition, the Venezuelan democracy, the Venezuelan Democrats do not have the guns and the torture methods and the capacity, the military capacity to face these criminals that have taken over and have hijacked what was one of Latin America's longest democracy, with great problems and great difficulties and great flaws, but it was a democracy. You know, you had elections and it was not obvious who was going to win the election. There were competitive elections. And it was a country with a lot of flaws, but nothing compared to what we see today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Dr. Pereira, would you like to add to this briefly before we move to questions?
I will not elaborate on the scenario where things stay the same because I try to be optimistic. So I will say that I am hopeful that democracy will return to Venezuela, that we know from studying Latin America that in every case where there has been a transition away from authoritarianism, save for 2 cases, so we know about 2, the transition has come about through negotiation. That's in the best interest, not just of the opposition, but also of the regime, as when the outgoing regime is involved in negotiations, they're able to secure more concessions, as we've seen in the transitions in Chile and in Brazil that involved certain levels of amnesty for some of the people that were implicated in human rights abuses. I am concerned about the fragmentation of Venezuela, as Moisés described it, as being a barrier towards achieving the kind of negotiations that would be necessary to get to democracy. But I am hopeful that democracy is possible, and I'm confident that without the ongoing attention from Western countries, from countries that believe in democracy, Venezuela will not be able to get there.
Fantastic. And Mr. Humire, would you like to add to that very quickly as well?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think the most important lesson today about the Venezuela crisis and what we've learned over previous years of trying to wrestle with the crisis is that the Venezuelan crisis is not an isolated case. It's part of a larger network. And the Maduro regime doesn't function like a Westphalian democratic state. They have used networks in a way to provide themselves oxygen to be able to persist into power and to be able to move other countries more towards their geopolitical orbit. In 2019, when the maximum pressure strategy started, we had places like Bolivia at the end of that year transitioning towards a potential change away from a Maduro ally. You had Argentina, you had the Macri government in Argentina that was an ally and not favorable to the Maduro regime. And you had Peru, which was a country that where the Lima group was originated, where it had a president that was not in favor of the regime. You fast forward 2 years later, and that scenario is quickly diminishing. We have to not just focus on solving Venezuela from within Venezuela, but solving Venezuela from throughout the region. What's going on today in Colombia is very concerning. And while there's still elements that are investigating any connection to Venezuela, what we do know is in the cyber domain, there's plenty of disinformation that's being pushed out from Venezuela. So we have to look at the Venezuela crisis as not an isolated incident, but part of a larger network that has captured Venezuela today, but is going to capture other countries tomorrow unless it's neutralized.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'd like to now open the floor to questions from our audience. We have a couple in the Q&A section as well, so I can ask those to the panel directly. And if anyone has a question from the attendees, please feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you. But firstly, from the Q&A, we have an anonymous question, from an attendee saying, does the panel think that Chavez would have succeeded if the price of oil had not skyrocketed shortly after he took power?
Short answer, absolutely not. 100% he would not have succeeded.
Okay, okay, so we have a second question now. So also from an anonymous attendee, what about the players behind Chavez, like Michelena? Would there have been a Chavez without these brains guiding him?
I'll take a crack at that. If you appreciate anything what I've been saying over the course of the webinar, is that there's been a lot of influences on Chavez. We talked about Cuba, we talked about Syria, we talked about Egypt, and I think that in that what you can take away from that is Venezuela has developed an elaborate asymmetric warfare strategy. In fact, Chavez talked about this very publicly. In 2004, he elaborated a document called the New Strategic Map of Venezuela. In 2005, he presented it, and he, quote, said, "I call upon everybody to start an effort to comprehend the ideas, concepts, and doctrine of asymmetric war." That's a quote from Hugo Chavez from 2005 at the first military forum on fourth generation of asymmetric war. You fast forward to 2008, and that's where he broke what they called he introduced the new geometry of power. And this is what Fabiana was talking about in the beginning. He shifted the traditional conventional paradigm of military and defense, which was usually used to protect state sovereignty under the conventional domains of war, air, sea, land. And he shifted that to create a new defense model, like what he calls an integrated defense model, to not the protection of state sovereignty, but the territorial expansion on behalf of the regime. Chavez was quoted as saying, "We're using this new model to, quote, break the chains of Venezuela's old conservative imperial and colonial geography." So that whole restructuring of the Venezuelan armed forces, which happened in 2008, has set up what Maduro is using today. The Venezuelan military is not broken up into Army, Navy, Air Force is broken up into regional combatant commands that are called readies that control territory through illicit networks and use illicit networks as a vanguard, a 21st century vanguard, to have presence in other countries, particularly adversarial countries such as Colombia. So I think understanding that asymmetric warfare strategy that was elaborated by Chavez and continued by Nicolas Maduro is critical to understanding how to deal with what they're doing for Venezuela.
Fantastic, thank you so much. So we have time for one last question very quickly from Maya Blanco. She says, if Chavez had not died, do you think he would have been able to handle the current situation better than Maduro?
Yes, it would have been a disaster and not a catastrophe. So that's the answer. With Maduro, we have a catastrophic debacle. With Chavez, we would have a disaster. He would have handled a little bit better some of the situations in terms of finances and economy, but it's still, compared to what we have, it will be marginally better. But in terms of what the country deserves, needs, and deserves, as I said, Chavez would have been a disaster. Chavez was a disaster. And remember that a lot of what we're witnessing today are policies that he first adopted and that Maduro just continues automatically to follow.
Sorry, I'm muted. I think we're going to wrap it up here as we've run out of time. But thank you so much to our fantastic panelists for your time. And it's been a really insightful discussion. It's been a pleasure hosting you guys all tonight. And yeah, so I think we'll end it here. Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. Have a good one.